Hello, I'm Professor Tucker from St. Petersburg College in the Ethics Department. In this video, we want to talk briefly about human rights and the global context. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations was approved in 1948. Of the 58 member nations, 48 voted in favor. It is somewhat of a combination of natural rights perspective, which believes that rights are common to humanity and can be derived from humanness, and social contract, which looks for the common agreement. But the complication begins almost immediately. Nations that abstained included the Soviet Union, its socialist neighbors, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa. And the complications continue. The UN has often been ineffective when atrocities are committed. Right now we look at the war in Ukraine, including alleged war crimes. And what has the United Nations been able to do? What of the persecution of the Uyghurs in China? How is it that some of the nations we consider to be the worst offenders end up leading the Human Rights Commission of the UN? When it comes to human rights and the global environment, there has never been a true consensus. As a forum, the UN no doubt has been valuable, but has clearly been ineffective in establishing global human rights in practice. The unity's just not there. Let us review a few things rather quickly. The textbook points out some very important aspects of the United Nations presentation of human rights, and I will recommend those to you. The challenge is still before us of how to develop a global vision. Some would argue that the challenge of defining human rights is greater today than it was in 1948. It may be a good thing that the influence of the Western view of human rights is declining and the voice of non-Western nations is increasing, but is there a consensus arising from the non-Western world? Almost immediately after 1948, differences emerged. Many in the non-Western world saw the UN Declaration as expressing Western values and built upon Jewish and Christian assumptions being imposed on the rest of the world. Eventually, a group of Middle Eastern countries produced their own alternative called the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights, which reflects a more Islamic cultural heritage. The World Court has come under similar criticism. Is it just another tool of Western imperialism? The United States doesn't even subscribe to it. Desmond Tutu disagrees, but remember Desmond Tutu was trying to find justice in South Africa during the time of apartheid. Some others, as in the article on the PowerPoint, from Kenya in particular, argued that the World Court is simply an imposition of Western viewpoints and particularly focused on prosecuting African leaders. Why is it, they asked, that more are prosecuted from Africa than any other cultures? A tool of imperialism. In Asia, the framework of human rights perspective is sometimes considered to be a Western construct that doesn't produce a good society. Western human rights arguments lead to individualism and self-interest. Value systems derived from Confucianism and other Asian philosophies lead to a focus on responsibility within relationships and the obligation to contribute to society. Supporting the collective community is more important than individual expression or belief. Previously, we quoted the phrase from Karl Marx, from each according to his or her ability, to each according to his or her need. It's a beautiful, heartwarming phrase. As a religious value or belief, or as a personal goal, it is pro-social. But, as we previously asked, can it be the foundation of a theory of human rights? This is being considered not only in the United States, but in various countries throughout the world. The fundamental right becomes that of equity, and all other rights are secondary and granted by the government. That is, the government that is responsible for equal outcomes. Individualism and self-interest will not lead to, it is argued, a just or happy society. Some years ago, a reporter confronted Fidel Castro about human rights violations. Persons are imprisoned for speaking out against the government or for protests. Religious worship is regulated and limited. Castro's response was that in Cuba, there's a higher literacy rate and more universal health care than there is in the U.S. Which society has more rights? Interesting question. The difference here is that of negative and positive rights. We talked about this in a couple of previous videos. An interesting, very recent issue was that of the international promotion of an American view of transgenderism. Biden, who considers himself to be a practicing Catholic, said that banning transgender treatments for minors is close to sinful, while Pope Francis said that gender ideology is a dangerous expression of colonialism, the West imposing its viewpoint on the rest of the world. Do we not denounce colonialism? If Pope Francis were the only one religious voice, it might be less significant. However, there's a great deal of objection and opposition to Western ideas of gender and gender ideology, especially in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Is this a form of Western imperialism? Or is it promoting real universal human rights? There are some issues that we might have thought were settled. Mauritania, a country in West Africa, still practices slavery, yet we hear very little about it. In Mauritania, the slavery is racial, intergenerational, very much like Southern American slavery. Light-skinned Arab race persons own Afro-Mauritanians. Officially, it's outlawed, but it's not enforced, and the slaves may make up to 20% of the population. Slavery of a more subtle type can still be found. An African might be bought by an oil-wealthy nation. The sponsor, quote unquote, will take the person's passport so they cannot leave, and then these workers can be bought and sold under the table using Facebook and WhatsApp. So what then do we do about human rights? So much controversy. And how do we live now? There does not appear to be a global consensus on human rights. There appears to be a need for a new theory or a new way to build a global consensus. Thank you for joining.